All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Absolutely. Always ready to dig in.
Today, we're going to be looking at terrorism and insurgency.
Oh, a timely topic, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. And to help us kind of unpack all this, we're going to be focusing specifically on a recent attack in Pakistan.
Oh,
So we've got a few different sources that we're going to be pulling from.
hmm.
We've got a news report from Dalian.com, which details the actual attack itself. We've got some statements from the Pakistan Army Chief of Staff,
Okay.
and then some more kind of general background information on terrorism from sources like uh, the U.S. State Department, Wikipedia, and even a Council of Europe manual.
Interesting.
Yeah, so kind of trying to get that broad perspective.
Yeah, good mix of sources.
Exactly. So our mission today, if you will, is to try and understand what happened in this specific attack in Balochistan, see how it fits into this bigger picture of terrorism and insurgency.
Okay.
And ultimately, why should you care? Why does this matter?
Yeah, because these things, they always seem far away, but they do end up impacting all of us.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get into it. That DonN.com report. It describes a coordinated attack in Balochistan, terrorists setting up roadblocks, engaging in a firefight with security forces. 18 soldiers were killed, and according to the Pakistani military's media wing, the ISPR, 23 terrorists were also killed.
Okay, and what's really interesting here is, that response from the ISPR. They're putting a lot of emphasis on the disruption of peace in the region, blaming, quote, inimical and hostile forces, end quote. So, it's definitely an attempt to project that strength, that control, but it also raises some questions about why this attack specifically is being framed as such a threat to peace.
Yeah, that inimical forces language, it's pretty loaded, right? It feels like they're hinting at something more, something beyond just this one attack.
Right, right. And without further information from the source, we can't definitively say who they're referring to. But it is a term often used, especially in geopolitical contexts, to suggest the involvement of some external actors. So that could be other countries, it could be intelligence agencies. It really makes you think about the fog of war, right? Information is often incomplete, and different parties have their own agendas when it comes to shaping that narrative.
So we're talking potentially like a web of international intrigue here.
Potentially, yeah. It just underscores that this isn't just a localized event. Terrorism, insurgency, they often have these roots that extend far beyond the immediate location of the attack.
It makes you think about how interconnected everything really is.
Exactly. And it highlights just how important it is for all of us to be really critical consumers of the information that we're taking in, particularly when we're talking about events like this.
Yeah, to really kind of like parse through that and look for those ulterior motives, potentially.
Exactly. Always ask, who benefits from this particular narrative?
Good advice. So in addition to that ISPR statement, we also have responses from the Pakistani Prime Minister and Interior Minister. They're both condemning the terrorism, of course, praising the security forces, and emphasizing their resolve to fight back.
Okay.
The Prime Minister, he even linked this attack to the country's broader development goals for Balochistan.
Right. And that is a very common tactic that we see from governments that are facing these sorts of terrorism threats. They try to rally public support, project that unified front, and really frame the fight as, part of this larger effort to build a better future.
Right, that we're all in this together kind of message.
Exactly.
And I can see how that would be effective. It creates a sense of solidarity, of purpose.
Absolutely. But it is also crucial for us to kind of look beyond that rhetoric and ask those tough questions. Are they really addressing the root causes of the terrorism? Or is this just an opportunity to kind of advance some pre-existing agendas?
Using a crisis as an opportunity, but maybe not always for the best reasons. Now, let's take a look at that statement from the Army Chief of Staff. It's pretty concise. He says that any misadventure from India will be responded to with full force.
Okay.
What are they saying there? Are they implying that India is behind this attack?
It's hard to say for sure, again, without more direct evidence from the source. But you have to remember that Pakistan and India have a long and complicated history. Tensions are often really high, especially in those border regions. So it's not surprising that they're operating under this assumption that India could be involved or at least try to exploit the situation.
Right, because it benefits them in some ways.
Potentially, yeah. It's definitely a calculated statement intended to serve as a warning, a deterrent. They're saying, hey, we're watching and we're ready to defend ourselves.
It's almost like a preemptive move in a chess match.
Exactly.
Okay, so all of this raises a really important question. What are we even talking about when we say terrorism?
Right.
I mean, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but could you actually define it?
And that's the tricky part. There isn't one universally accepted definition. It's a very politicized term, and different groups will use it in different ways to advance their own agendas.
Okay, so how do our sources define it then?
Well, they do highlight some common threads. Generally speaking, terrorism involves violence, and that violence is directed against non-combatants, meaning civilians who aren't directly involved in any kind of fighting.
Right, so it's not just about the violence itself, but who it's targeting.
Exactly. And the goal of this violence is usually to achieve some kind of political or ideological change. It's about using fear and intimidation to try to influence public opinion, pressure governments into concessions, that sort of thing.
So it's really about the message behind the violence, what they're hoping to achieve through these acts.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that it's not always organized groups carrying out these attacks. It can be individuals, it can be state actors. In fact, some of our sources talk about state-sponsored terrorism, which is when a government actively supports or even directs terrorist activities.
And that just adds a whole other layer of complexity to this whole thing.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting that the U.S. State Department considers Pakistan's neighbor, Iran, to be state sponsor of terrorism, which obviously adds another wrinkle to this whole regional dynamic.
Right, it complicates things even further.
Significantly.
So we've got this mix of historical conflict, political maneuvering, accusations being thrown around, and then you layer on top of that the very real human cost of terrorism. The lives lost, the families shattered. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. It's heavy stuff. And I think
Yeah.
it's important to remember that these aren't just abstract concepts we're discussing. These have real-world impacts on people's lives.
Absolutely. And we can't lose sight of that. Speaking of real-world impacts, 2024 was the deadliest year for Pakistani security forces in a decade.
Oh, wow.
So what are some of the factors that are contributing to this persistence of terrorism, especially in a place like Pakistan?
Well, there are a lot of factors, and our sources touch on a whole range of them, both internal and external.
Okay, let's break it down a little bit.
So internally, you've got things like political instability and weak governance, which can create these breeding grounds for terrorist groups. They thrive in chaos and power vacuums, exploiting those situations to recruit members and establish themselves.
So a weak government can almost create opportunities for these groups to take hold.
Exactly. And then you've got socioeconomic grievances, things like poverty, lack of opportunity, discrimination. When people feel marginalized and hopeless, they become much more susceptible to these extremist ideologies that offer them a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging.
It's like this toxic mix of desperation and ideology.
That's a good way to put it.
So it's not just about material conditions, it's also about those deeply held beliefs that can drive people to these extremes.
Exactly. And those beliefs can be incredibly powerful motivators, providing a framework for understanding the world and justifying violence as a means to achieve their goals.
Right, so it's almost like a distorted worldview where violence becomes not just acceptable, but necessary.
Yeah, and that's where the external factors come in as well. Groups like the TTP, for example, often receive support from state sponsors or other terrorist organizations. That support can take many forms: safe havens, training, funding, weapons. It really enables them to operate and carry out their attacks.
So it's not just about internal dynamics, it's also about these external forces that are enabling and supporting these groups.
Exactly. And then you have to factor in the role of propaganda and recruitment efforts. They're very sophisticated in how they exploit existing tensions and grievances to draw in new members.
It's like a vicious cycle, one problem feeding into the next.
It is. And when you fail to address those root causes, you just perpetuate that cycle of violence.
It just seems so bleak. Is there even any hope of ending terrorism, or are we just stuck in this forever?
It's a question a lot of people are asking. And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. It's going to take a multifaceted approach. It's a long process, that's for sure. Ending terrorism isn't something that happens overnight. But I think acknowledging that and understanding what we've been talking about, the factors involved, that's got to be the first step.
Okay, so knowledge is power? Is that what you're saying?
Well, to some extent, yeah. When we understand the motivations, the tactics, the support systems that these terrorist groups rely on, it helps. It helps us develop better strategies to counter them.
Okay, but strategies for who? Are we talking governments here?
Governments definitely have a big role to play, yeah, but it's got to be bigger than that. Think about that Council of Europe manual, the one we mentioned earlier. They put a lot of emphasis on respecting human rights, even when you're fighting terrorism, which means No torture, no extrajudicial killings, no discrimination.
Because that stuff can backfire, right? I mean, it seems counterintuitive, but
Exactly. Those kinds of actions, they can alienate entire communities, create resentment, and end up fueling the very extremism that we're trying to fight against.
so not super helpful in the long run.
Not at all. It's like, pouring gasoline on a fire.
Definitely want to do that. So, what are some of the more effective approaches then? If those are the things to avoid, what should we be focusing on?
Well, we've got to address the root causes, the things we were just talking about. That means poverty, lack of education, lack of opportunity. We need to create opportunities for the people who might otherwise feel like they're marginalized or left behind.
Right, give them a stake in the system.
Exactly. And it also means strengthening governance, making sure the rule of law is applied fairly,
Yeah.
making sure everyone feels like they have a voice, that they matter.
So it's a much bigger picture than just military force.
Oh, absolutely. Military action might be necessary sometimes, sure, but it's only one piece of a much larger puzzle. We need to build trust. We need to foster dialogue, promote reconciliation.
Which means what? Like actually talking to people? Like really listening?
Exactly. Engaging with these communities, listening to their concerns, trying to address their grievances in a way that feels meaningful, that feels real.
I can see how that would be difficult. It sounds like a very long and probably messy process.
It is. It is. And it takes a lot of patience, a lot of commitment from everyone involved. But I think it's essential if we're ever going to get to a place where terrorism doesn't have this foothold that it has in so many parts of the world.
It's starting to make sense why you said this isn't just about governments, it's about individuals too.
Exactly. We all have a responsibility to be informed, to be critical thinkers, to challenge prejudice and discrimination when we see it.
Oh, so like speak up when you see something wrong, even if it's uncomfortable?
Yes. Even if it's in your own family. We have to be willing to have those tough conversations, to try to understand where other people are coming from, to build bridges across these divides, and advocate for peaceful solutions.
It almost sounds like we're talking about changing hearts and minds as much as changing policies.
You got it. Because, at its core, terrorism thrives on fear and hatred and division. But if we can counter those forces with understanding and empathy, with a real commitment to justice, then I think we can start to chip away at those foundations, at what allows terrorism to flourish.
It sounds like a tall order, but it's also kind of empowering to think that each of us can actually make a difference.
We can. We absolutely can.
Yeah.
It might feel like a drop in the bucket sometimes, but all those drops, they add up. Remember, change starts with individuals.
Yeah.
If each of us commits to building a more peaceful, a more just world in our own little corner of the world, it's going to have a ripple effect.
I like that, the ripple effect.
Right. So I think there's reason to be hopeful, absolutely, but it's not going to be easy.
It's going to take work, and it's going to take all of us.
You got it. And it's not about being naive or pretending the threat isn't real, because it is. But despair and inaction, those aren't options either.
Oh, okay. So we're choosing to be hopeful, choosing to act.
Yes. We have to believe that a better world is possible, and then we have to work towards it together.
This has been, well, it's definitely been a roller coaster of a deep dive, that's for sure. Lots of emotions. But I think I'm coming out of it feeling a little bit more informed.
Good. I'm glad.
And yeah, maybe even a little bit hopeful.
That's what we like to hear. Knowledge is power, but only if we use it wisely, right?
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's one thing that keeps coming back to me, and that's the human cost of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Those 18 soldiers killed in Balochistan and all the others who have been lost in attacks like this around the world.
It's heartbreaking. It really is.
It is. It's easy to get caught up in the statistics, the political analysis, all that.
Right. It can feel very abstract.
But we can't forget that these are real people, real families, real communities that are being torn apart.
And their stories deserve to be heard, their pain acknowledged.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that the people who commit these acts of terrorism, they're often driven by their own pain, their own experiences of injustice.
Hmm?
It doesn't excuse their actions, obviously, but it adds another layer to this whole conversation.
It does. It reminds us that we can't just treat the symptoms. We have to understand and address those underlying causes, those systemic issues that contribute to this cycle of violence.
Right, breaking that cycle, preventing these tragedies from happening in the first place.
Exactly.
Okay, so before we wrap up completely, I want to bring this back to our listeners. What can they do? I mean, what are some concrete steps they can take to make a difference, to promote peace and understanding?
Well, we've talked about staying informed, right? So Read about these issues, engage with different perspectives, and don't be afraid to question those narratives, especially the ones that are designed to create fear and division.
So, like, don't just passively absorb information, actually engage with it critically.
Exactly. And talk to people. Have those tough conversations with people who hold different viewpoints. You never know. You might learn something, or you might plant a seed that could grow into something really beautiful.
Building bridges instead of walls.
Exactly.
And remember, this isn't about instant gratification.
Right. It's a long game, for sure.
It's about those small actions, those conversations, those moments of understanding that contribute to a better future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every little bit counts. You can support organizations that are working for peace. You can volunteer your time. You can donate to causes you care about. Even just small acts of kindness, of compassion, those make a difference.
Choosing hope over despair, choosing action over apathy.
You said it perfectly.
This has been a really insightful conversation. I mean, it's been heavy at times, but also really important to have these conversations.
It has. It has.
And, as always, we want to thank our listeners for coming along with us on this journey.
We appreciate you all.
We hope you've gained a better understanding of these complex issues, the issues around terrorism and insurgency.
And that you feel empowered to make a difference however you can.
We can't fix everything in one podcast, but if we can spark a conversation, if we can encourage some critical thinking, and maybe inspire someone to take action, then I think we've done our job.
Well said. I couldn't agree more.
So until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better world.
Absolutely. And thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. Yeah, it's easy to think about this stuff on that global scale, the big picture.
Right, the politics and all of that.
But you're absolutely right. It's individuals who feel this most acutely.
They're the ones on the front lines experiencing the consequences.
Exactly. And that's why I think that Council of Europe manual, their focus on human rights, it's so crucial. It's like this reminder that even when we're fighting something as horrific as terrorism, we can't just abandon our values.
Right, because then what are we even fighting for?
Exactly. We can't become the very thing that we're trying to defeat.
That's such a powerful point. So where do we go from here? What are some actual things, some steps that our listeners can take to make a difference?
Well, we've been talking about education, right? About staying informed. So keep learning, keep reading, keep listening, but do it critically.
Okay, so be discerning.
Yeah, exactly. Don't just take everything at face value. Question the narratives, especially the ones that are trying to sow fear and division.
Right. So be an active participant in taking in this information, not just a passive recipient.
Exactly. Exactly. And don't be afraid to talk to people. Have those conversations, even the difficult ones, with people who might see things differently than you do.
Because you might actually learn something.
You absolutely might. And even if you don't change their mind, you might just plant a seed of understanding that could grow into something really powerful.
I like that imagery. It's about building bridges, right? Not walls.
Absolutely. And remember, change, it rarely happens overnight. This is a long game we're playing. But every conversation, every act of kindness, every time someone speaks out against injustice, it all contributes to that more peaceful future.
It's that ripple effect again.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of your own actions. You can support organizations that are doing great work. You can volunteer your time. You can donate to causes that resonate with you. Even just those small acts of compassion, they can make a world of difference.
It's about making that choice, right? Choosing hope over despair, choosing action over apathy.
Couldn't said it better myself.
Oh, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. It's been a heavy topic for sure.
It has.
But it's been a really important one to explore. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey.
We appreciate you all tuning in.
We hope you found it informative, maybe even a little bit inspiring. I mean, we can't solve all the world's problems in one podcast.
Definitely not, no.
But if we can spark a conversation, if we can encourage people to think critically about these issues, and if even one person is inspired to take action, then I think we've done our job.
I think so too. Well said.
So until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, keep striving for that better world.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.